"You're the bookkeeper." "Really?" He didn't even look up from the folder in his hands when he said it. Just let the words fall out like he was commenting on the weather, flat, careless, mildly amused. Hazel Pruitt had heard worse. She told herself that every single morning in the mirror of her studio apartment on West Cullerton, usually while she was still in her pajamas and avoiding the full-length reflection, she'd turned slightly toward the wall. She had a system. It worked. Most days, she shifted the leather portfolio under her arm and kept her voice even. "That's what it says on my contract." That made him look up. Ronan Thatch had eyes the color of deep water in November. Not the romantic kind people wrote about, but the real kind. The kind that looked cold because it was. He sat at the head of the conference table in a room that probably cost more per square foot than her entire building, and he looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. Like he was doing a calculation. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She opened her portfolio, uncapped her pen, and looked at him with the same expression she used when reviewing tax documents. Focused, neutral, giving nothing away. Ronan Thatch was the kind of man whose name people said differently depending on what room they were in. In City Hall, they said it carefully. In the financial district, they said it quickly and moved on. In certain parts of the South Side, they didn't say it at all. They just nodded, and everyone understood. He ran Thatch Capital, officially. Unofficially, he ran considerably more than that. The rumor was that 3 city council members had his personal number saved under a fake name. The rumor was also that he'd once had a shipment of uncut diamonds rerouted through a suburban dry cleaning chain, and nobody had asked questions because nobody wanted the answers. Hazel knew all of this because she had spent 6 years as a forensic accountant, and she recognized the particular fingerprints of creative bookkeeping the way a sommelier recognized cheap wine by the smell, before she even tasted it. She also knew that the man across from her had requested her specifically. That part she didn't have an explanation for yet. "You came from Deloitte," he said. It wasn't a question. 4 years, she confirmed. Before that, Federal Audit Division. Something shifted slightly behind his eyes. Not much. Just enough. "And you left the Federal Division because the work was more interesting in the private sector," she said. "And the pay is better." It was a practiced answer. True enough to be believable, incomplete enough to be safe. The full version involved a supervisor who'd taken credit for 3 of her most complex cases, and a whistleblower complaint she'd filed that had gone exactly nowhere. But that version wasn't relevant here. Ronan Thatch looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. "My last accountant," he said, retired. Hazel had done her research before this meeting. She knew that the previous head of accounts at Thatch Capital, a man named Douglas Ferris, had not retired. Douglas Ferris had been found on a park bench in Grant Park in February, with both his shoes missing and a look of profound terror still frozen on his face. The medical examiner had ruled it cardiac arrest. Hazel had looked at the financial statements Douglas Ferris had signed off on for the past 2 years, and had privately concluded that Douglas Ferris had known something he shouldn't have, had failed to manage that knowledge with discretion, and had paid accordingly. She had taken this job anyway. She was not entirely sure what that said about her. "I read the quarterly reports," she said. "There are some inconsistencies in the asset allocation columns for the last 3 quarters. Nothing that would flag in a standard audit, but you found them. I find things," she said simply. Ronan Thatch leaned back in his chair. It was a slow movement, the kind of deliberate physical control that people with real power used, the opposite of fidgeting. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that didn't read as calm so much as contained, like something that had learned not to move too fast because it already knew it was the most dangerous thing in the room. He looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't expected. "You start Monday," he said. She capped her pen. "I need access to the full ledger going back 5 years, not 3, and I'll need a separate workstation. No shared server access, no IT oversight. A pause. You're asking for a lot of trust, he said. For someone who's been in this office for 11 minutes, you're asking for a lot of discretion, she replied. From someone you've known for 11 minutes. I think we're even. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, something moved across Ronan Thatcher's face that wasn't calculation. It lasted about half a second. It looked almost like surprise. Monday, he said again. Hazel Pruitt stood, smoothed her blazer over her hips, the automatic gesture she'd been doing since she was 17, and which she'd mostly stopped apologizing for, and walked out of the room without looking back. In the elevator, once the doors closed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had no idea what she'd just agreed to. She had a feeling she was going to find out. The office she was given was on the 14th floor, one level below the executive suite, with a window that faced north and a door that locked from the inside. Both details, she suspected, were intentional. Whether they were meant to protect her or contain her, she hadn't decided yet. She spent the first week doing what she always did in a new environment. She stayed quiet, she watched, and she learned the geometry of the place. Thatch Capital, surface level, was a legitimate investment firm. It had a real board, real clients, real returns. Enough of each to withstand scrutiny from anyone who didn't look too hard. The people who worked there were mostly real too, in the sense that they did their actual jobs and asked few questions and had probably convinced themselves that the money was clean. Hazel did not convince herself of things. It wasn't in her nature. By the end of the first week, she had mapped 3 separate sets of books. One was for the board, one was for the government. The third was the real one, the one that tracked the actual flow of assets through a network of shell entities so layered and interlocking that it would have taken a team of federal investigators 6 months to begin to unravel it. It took her 4 days. She did not announce this discovery. She organized the information in her own private notation, saved to an encrypted drive she kept in her jacket pocket, and continued arriving at 8:15 and leaving at 6:30, and saying good morning to the receptionist whose name was Joy, and who always had a book on her desk. The only person who seemed to actually notice her was Ronan Thatch. He did it quietly. She'd catch it in small ways. The fact that fresh coffee appeared on her desk each morning, always the right order, which she hadn't given anyone. The fact that when she requested the extended ledger access, it was approved within an hour. The fact that once, when a senior partner named Aldous had interrupted her mid-presentation to suggest that perhaps she'd made a computational error. The kind of interruption that was really a performance, a display for the room, the way men sometimes needed to establish their position. Ronan had said, without looking up from his own documents, she didn't. Aldous had sat back down. Nobody had asked Ronan how he knew. Hazel had kept her expression neutral and continued her presentation, but she'd felt it, a warmth in her chest that she didn't particularly want to examine, because examining things like that was how she got into trouble. She wasn't there to be noticed. She was there to do a job. The problem was that the job kept changing shape. It was a Thursday evening, 8 weeks into her tenure at Thatch Capital, when things stopped being theoretical. She was the last one on the 14th floor, which was normal. She'd started staying late to access the archived records that weren't available during business hours, which was the kind of initiative that nobody questioned because it looked like dedication. She was in the middle of cross-referencing a series of wire transfers against a timeline she'd reconstructed from shipping manifests when she heard the elevator open. She looked up. 2 men she didn't recognize stepped off. They weren't wearing building badges. They didn't have the particular quality that Ronan's actual security team had. The controlled stillness, the awareness. These men were tense in the way of people who were afraid and angry about being afraid. The taller one looked at her across the empty office. He didn't seem pleased to see her. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Neither are you," Hazel said. Her voice came out calmer than she felt. Years of sitting across from hostile clients had given her a tone she could deploy when needed. Steady, factual, refusing to assign panic to a situation before the situation required it. The men exchanged a look. The shorter one started toward the filing room. Hazel understood in that moment, with the particular clarity she usually reserved for financial discrepancies, exactly what was happening. Someone was here to take documents, records that implicated people who didn't want to be implicated. She knew which records they were, because she'd spent 2 months living with those records. And she was standing approximately 4 feet from the drawer that contained the physical backup files. She also knew that if those men walked out of here with those files, 3 ongoing federal investigations would collapse. She knew this because she had recently confirmed, through her own parallel reconstruction of the data, that someone inside the government had been feeding information to a competing organization. Information that had already gotten 2 informants killed. She'd been sitting on that knowledge for 11 days, trying to figure out what to do with it. The shorter man was getting closer to the filing room. Hazel made a decision. She stood up, walked to the filing cabinet with the brisk efficiency of someone who belonged there completely, pulled open the correct drawer, and removed the physical files with both hands. "These are under review," she said, in the exact tone she used when telling a client their documents were non-negotiable. "You'll need to submit a formal request." Both men stared at her. In the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Hazel became extremely aware that she was standing in an empty office, on a locked floor, holding documents that dangerous people wanted, and that her primary defense was the confidence of someone who'd worked too many hours to be particularly intimidated by rudeness. The taller man moved toward her. The elevator opened again. Ronan Thatch walked in. He didn't run. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked across the office with that same quality of contained stillness she'd noticed in the first meeting, and by the time he reached the center of the room, the 2 men had stopped moving entirely. It was the way certain animals froze when something larger entered their space. Not a decision, exactly, more like a reflex. He looked at the man nearest Hazel. "Get out," he said. They left. The elevator doors closed. The office was quiet. Ronan turned to look at Hazel. She was still holding the files. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were perfectly steady, which seemed biologically improbable, given that her heart was doing something alarming. "You should have called security," he said. "I didn't have time. You should have hidden. The files would have still been here." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "You knew what they were after," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the same tone he used when he'd confirmed that she'd found the inconsistencies in the quarterly reports, recognizing something rather than questioning it. "I know what everything in this office is," she said, a long pause. "Including things you weren't authorized to access." "Including things I accessed anyway," she agreed. "Because the pattern required it." She set the files down on the desk between them deliberately, the way she would set down evidence in a room where the truth was about to be established. "I know about the shell entities," she said. "I know about the 3 separate books. I know about the Meridian routing structure and the transit accounts that cycle through Latvia and the Cayman entities that don't exist on paper but absolutely do exist in practice." She paused. "I also know that someone inside the Eastfield Federal Task Force has been leaking investigative timelines to Carver's people for at least 14 months, and that 2 confidential informants are dead because of it." Ronan had gone very still. "I haven't told anyone," she said. "I'm not going to tell anyone, not without understanding the full picture first. But I need you to know that I know, because I'm not going to sit in an office in this building and pretend to be looking at the wrong thing. That's not how I work." The silence stretched. "Why are you telling me this?" Ronan said. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Careful, she realized, was different from cold. Because, she said, if I'm going to be in the middle of this, I'd rather be in it with the correct information than be managed with incomplete data. And because whoever those men were, they'll be back, and next time I'd like some actual notice. Something crossed Ronan Thatch's face, not the half-second surprise she'd seen in their first meeting. This was slower, more complicated, like he was looking at something he hadn't seen before and was still deciding what to call it. He pulled out his phone. "Get your things," he said. "You're not staying here tonight." "I still have." "Get your things, Hazel." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She got her things. He took her to a building in River North, which she immediately identified as a Thatch-owned property based on the infrastructure she'd seen in the asset ledgers, and she was installed in a fourth-floor apartment that was significantly nicer than her studio and had a kitchen that had clearly never been used. "You'll stay here while we determine who sent those men," he said. "And when you determine it, then we'll discuss your options." "My options," she repeated. "You've had access to information that could destabilize several significant interests," he said. "People will want to know the extent of what you know. How we manage that depends on what you want." He said it with the same direct economy he used for everything, but she noticed that he'd said how we manage it, not how I manage it. "What are my options?" she asked. He looked at her from across the kitchen island. He'd taken off his jacket somewhere between the parking structure and the apartment, and he was in a shirt and dark pants, which somehow made him seem more substantial rather than less. The way dangerous things sometimes became more apparent when they were slightly more relaxed. "You could disappear," he said. "I have the infrastructure to relocate people. New identity, clean start, different city. It's been done. You're very casual about that. I'm practical about it. The second option is that you stay, you work, and I ensure that the people who would prefer you silent understand that you are not to be touched." "And they'd listen?" "Yes," he said. It was not a boast. It was just a fact, stated the way she stated mathematical certainties. She looked at the kitchen island between them. There was a single bowl of fruit on it, which suggested that someone had been instructed to make the apartment look inhabited, and that person had defaulted to the universal shorthand for welcoming domestic space. "There's a third option," she said. He waited. "I stay. I work. I finish mapping the Meridian network, and I identify the federal leak. And then you and I figure out together what to do with that information." She met his eyes. "Because whoever those men were tonight, they weren't working for you. Which means you have a problem, and I am, professionally speaking, very good at problems." Ronan Thatch looked at her for a long time. She'd been looked at many ways in her life. The way people looked when they assumed she was the assistant, when she was the one who'd called the meeting. The way they looked when she was the smartest person in the room, and they needed a moment to recalibrate. The way they looked when they realized she wasn't going to make herself smaller to make them more comfortable. This was different. This was the look of someone who was trying to understand something that didn't fit into any category he already had. "You walked up to two men who were prepared to take those files by force," he said. "And you told them they needed to submit a formal request." "It worked for about 8 seconds, she said. "It shouldn't have worked at all." "I know, but I had the files and I needed to hold that position until something changed. So I held it." Another silence. "Why?" he said. "They weren't your files to protect. This isn't your war." Hazel thought about Douglas Ferris and his missing shoes. She thought about the 2 informants she'd read about in the federal documents she wasn't supposed to have accessed. She thought about the version of herself that had filed a complaint that went nowhere and walked away from a career she'd loved because the wrong person had power and nobody had stopped him. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said, "and because someone needed to do it, and I was the one standing there. Ronan Thatch set his hands flat on the kitchen island. He looked at her the way she'd come to learn. He looked at things he was about to decide about, with full attention, total stillness, like he was seeing something through to its end before he committed to a single action. "All right," he said. "All right, what? All right, we do it your way." She hadn't expected capitulation, not from him, not that easily. "That's it," she said. "You want me to negotiate?" I expected negotiation. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen 3 times in the past 2 months. The one that seemed to arrive, despite some effort to prevent it, the one that rearranged the entire geometry of his face for about a second and a half, and made her feel like she'd caught a glimpse of something real inside all that careful containment. "You've been mapping my operation for 8 weeks, he said. "You found things in 4 days that my previous accountant couldn't find in 4 years. You just held down a position against 2 armed men because it was right and someone needed to do it." He paused. "If I tried to out-negotiate you, Hazel, I'd lose." She looked at him. "Your previous accountant," she said carefully, "didn't actually retire." "No," he said. "He didn't. He found something and he panicked. He found something and he made a decision that put other people at risk," Ronan said. "The sequence after that was not my preference, but it happened." She understood that he was telling her this on purpose, that it was a kind of transparency offered to a woman who'd just demonstrated that she couldn't be managed with incomplete data. It was also, she recognized, a kind of warning, not a threat, but an honesty about what the world she'd stepped into actually contained. "I'm not going to panic," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the difference." She thought about that for a moment. "How do you know?" she asked. "You've known me for 2 months. "I knew in the first meeting," he said. "When you told me the pay was better in the private sector. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the right answer. Calibrated, strategic, giving me what I needed to hear without giving me anything that could be used against you." He paused. "You don't panic, you calculate, even when you're afraid." She hadn't told him she was afraid of anything. "I wasn't afraid," she said. He looked at her. "You were afraid when you walked in on those 2 men. You held the position anyway." He said it, matter-of-factly, the way he said everything. "That's not the absence of fear. That's something better." Hazel looked down at the kitchen island, at the bowl of fruit that nobody had put there for any real reason except to signal normalcy in a space that was anything but. She'd spent a long time making herself small and precise and unnoticeable. A pencil-thin line moving through rooms, taking up as little space as possible, becoming extremely good at her work because her work was the one place where she could be as large as she actually was, and have it not cause problems. She was not sure what to do with a man who had noticed her anyway. "I'm going to need the full access codes for the Meridian sub-accounts," she said, because that was the practical next step, and practical next steps were what she was good at. "You'll have them by morning," he said, "and a direct line to you. If I find something, I need to be able to reach you immediately, not go through your assistant. Done. And I want to know who those men were before I go to sleep." He picked up his phone. He made a call that lasted about 45 seconds and consisted almost entirely of the other person speaking, because Ronan Thatch did not need to say much to be understood. When he hung up, he set the phone down on the counter. "Carver's people," he said, "not the federal leak. They were running a separate track, trying to get to the physical records before we could digitize and disperse them. So Carver knows about the leak. Carver organized the leak." She let that land. It rearranged several things in the timeline she'd constructed. "That changes the reconstruction," she said. "I know. Give me 2 days." He looked at her. "You need 2 days to rebuild a 14-month financial timeline. 48 hours, she said. "Maybe less." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a workstation already set up in the second room. Same specs as your office." She should not have been surprised. She was not sure when she'd stopped being surprised by the ways he'd anticipated what she'd need. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it over the back of a chair. He was leaving, she understood, returning to whatever operational thing required his attention at 10:15 on a Thursday night, which was the life of the man who ran what he ran. He stopped at the door. "Hazel," he said. She looked up. "The men tonight. They were told to take the files and leave no witnesses." He said it plainly, without drama, because he said things plainly. "You held them in place for 11 minutes before I got there." She hadn't known it was 11 minutes. It had felt both shorter and much longer. 11 minutes, she said. "You want to know how I knew to come?" "I didn't ask." "There's a sensor on your workstation," he said. "If the door from the stairwell opens after 7:30, it notifies my phone." She absorbed this. "You've been watching the floor. I've been making sure you were safe," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't say anything for a moment. The distinction mattered, she thought, but she wasn't ready to say why it mattered or what she intended to do with the feeling that came with it. "Go run your operation," she said. "I'll have something for you in 48 hours. He nodded once. He left. The apartment was quiet. The bowl of fruit sat on the counter. The second room, when she pushed open the door, contained a workstation that was, in fact, exactly the right specs, down to the dual monitor setup she used for cross-referencing ledgers. She sat down, opened the first file, and began. She had it in 31 hours. The full Meridian network, the transit accounts, the shell entity structure going back to the original incorporation, the federal leak. Not a single person, but a coordinated arrangement between 3 mid-level task force administrators, each managing a separate stream of information, each paid through mechanisms so oblique that they'd been invisible in any single examination. You had to see all 3 at once, map the flows against each other, notice the moments where the timing aligned in ways that were statistically impossible if the 3 streams were independent. She had a gift for noticing things that were statistically impossible. She also had at the bottom of the Meridian structure something she hadn't expected. A transfer. Not large, not by the scale of what moved through these accounts, but specific and recent and routed through a channel that she now understood was reserved for one category of payment. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called Ronan. He answered on the first ring which she had started to expect. "I have the network," she said. "All of it, including the 3-stream leak structure." A pause. 31 hours. I told you 48. I was being conservative. Send it. I'm not sending it, she said. I need to show you something in person. Another pause. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 14. She walked him through the reconstruction first. The shell entities, the transit accounts, the leak structure, the way the 3 streams had been designed to be invisible in isolation and were only visible in aggregate. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he showed respect for information being delivered correctly. When she finished, she pulled up the final screen. "This transfer," she said, "is dated 6 days before Douglas Ferris died." She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the screen. "It routed through the protected channel," she said. "The one reserved for, as best I can reconstruct, enforcement operations." Silence. "I need you to tell me what it means," she said, "because I have a conclusion, and I need to know if my conclusion is wrong." Ronan stood beside her. She could feel the stillness of him, the quality that was not calm but contained. "Your conclusion is right," he said. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Douglas Ferris wasn't killed because he found something," she said. "He was killed because he found it and then tried to sell it to Carver." Yes. She opened her eyes. She looked at the transfer amount on the screen. "He took Carver's money," she said, "and then he got scared and tried to cover it, and by then it was too late." "Yes." She turned to look at Ronan Thatch. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "I did not find this and sit on it. I found it approximately 40 minutes ago, and I called you immediately, and I am showing it to you now. I am not Douglas Ferris. He looked at her. In the white light of the dual monitors, his face was sharper than usual. More angles, less shadow. He looked tired in a way she'd never seen on him before. I know, he said. I need you to actually know it, she said. Not strategically assess it and conclude it's probably true. Actually know it. Hazel, he said. I know. The way he said her name had changed. Somewhere in the last 31 hours, or the last 2 months, or the last 11 minutes of a Thursday evening, when she had stood in front of 2 armed men and refused to move. It had weight to it now. Like, it meant something more than just the name. She turned back to the screen. There's enough here, she said, to dismantle Carver's operation entirely. The shell network, the leak structure, the connection to the informant deaths, all of it is documented. She paused. There's also enough here to cause significant problems for Thatch Capital if it were submitted to the wrong people. I'm aware, he said. I'm not going to submit it to anyone, she said. That's not a threat, and it's not a negotiation. It's just a fact. Why? He said. She looked at the screen, at the months of work compressed into a reconstruction that told a story most people wouldn't have been able to find or follow or hold together long enough to understand. Because Carver had 2 informants killed, she said. Because the people who run this city the legal way have been letting that happen. And because you, for all the things you are, have not once in 8 weeks treated me like I wasn't the most capable person in the room. She paused. I've worked in rooms where I was the most capable person for years, and nobody ever said so out loud. Another silence. What do you want to do with it? He said. She looked at the Meridian network, at the 3-stream leak, at the transfer dated 6 days before a man had died on a park bench in February. Carver first, she said. The leak structure gives us enough to make his operation visible to people he cannot buy. The federal administrators, they're a separate problem. And I have an idea for that too, but Carver first. All right, and I want it done legally, or as close to legally as this situation allows. Something that was almost amusement moved through his expression. You're in the building of a man who runs 3 sets of books, and you want it done legally. I want the outcome to be durable, she said. Illegal takedowns can be unwound. Legal ones are permanent. She paused. I have a contact at the federal level who isn't in any of these files. She's clean. If we feed her the right documentation in the right sequence, Carver goes down in a way that doesn't require us to explain how we accessed any of this. You planned this, he said. I planned a version of it, she said. The version where I might eventually need to do something with what I'd found. I didn't plan for Carver's people to show up on Thursday and accelerate the timeline. Ronan looked at her. Hazel, he said. Yes? When I hired you, he said, I was told you were a very good accountant. I am a very good accountant. I was not told, he said, that you were also going to solve a problem that I have been working on for 2 years. She looked at the screen, then at him. The math was always there, she said. Someone just had to look at all of it at once. He took a step toward the workstation. Not toward her, exactly. Or not only toward her, but into the space that had been only hers for 31 hours, the space of the reconstruction, the evidence, the careful assembly of truth from chaos. He stood close enough that she could see the detail of the tiredness in his face, the weight of whatever this case had cost him in the 2 years he'd been working it. And she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. That behind all the containment, behind the stillness and the cold water eyes and the way rooms reorganized themselves, when he walked in, there was someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time. Thank you, he said. It was simple, completely unadorned. Nothing performed about it. She looked at him. You should sleep, she said. I need to prepare the documentation sequence before we contact my federal source. It'll take me another few hours. She paused. And you're not going to be useful to anyone if you're running on whatever you're currently running on. He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd ever seen him get to it. The real thing, not the suppressed almost smile, but actual laughter, caught and held back by the same mechanism that held everything back. Yes, he said. All right. He picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. There's a second bedroom, he said, down the hall. I'll be on this floor. She realized he wasn't leaving the building. Of course he wasn't. He had spent 2 months making sure she was safe in a building that, as of Thursday, had been accessed by Carver's people. He was not going to leave her in an apartment alone, because that was not how he operated. She understood this without finding it suffocating, which surprised her slightly. There's fruit in the kitchen, she said. I noticed. Nobody actually put it there for eating. I know. It's a very good prop, though. He stopped at the door of the room and looked back at her. In the monitor light, something in his face had settled into something she didn't have a word for yet. Not soft exactly. Nothing about Ronan Thatch was soft, but open, present. Like the containment had found its limit, not because it had failed, but because he'd decided, deliberately and deliberately, that here was a place it didn't need to hold. Hazel, he said. She looked up from the screen. You're the best bookkeeper I've ever had, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was Ronan Thatch saying the exact thing he meant, in the exact way he said things. Directly, without performance, with the full weight of what he actually knew behind it. She looked back at the screen so he wouldn't see what her face was doing. I know, she said. She heard him almost laugh again, down the hall, and then the sound of the second door closing, and then the quiet of the apartment settling around her. Hazel Pruitt pulled up the documentation sequence, flexed her fingers, and began to build the case that was going to take Carver apart. Outside, Chicago's skyline held the dark with the particular stillness of a city that had too many secrets to sleep easily. She understood the feeling. She worked anyway.